An adventurer is someone who takes on missions through guild branches found across many countries, earning a living by completing jobs that offer rewards in return. The work covers everything from defeating monsters to delivering materials and much more besides. Some adventurers rise to become celebrated heroes by slaying fearsome dragons that threaten the lives of ordinary people. Others go deep into dangerous dungeons and come back carrying unimaginable riches and rare treasures. In a world like this, people with dreams to chase are never in short supply. The next person in line was called forward. A young man named Ark felt a rush of excitement move through him, thinking to himself that today was finally the day their adventure was beginning in earnest. The story starts here, at the Adventurers Guild in the Boltana branch. While standing in the queue, a nervous sound came from right beside him. Ark told the girl next to him not to be so tense, pointing out that they were almost at the front for their appraisal, and asked what was going on. He reached over and took her hand. The girl, whose name was Leanne, smiled and asked whether he was not nervous himself, saying she was curious about what kind of ability she might have. Ark looked at her and went quiet for a moment. She noticed and called his name with a light smile. He stumbled a little over his words and said that when it came to Leanne, he was certain everything would be fine. A memory surfaced as he looked at her. This was Leanne. They had been born and raised in the same village, childhood friends who had grown up dreaming over the same adventure stories and had eventually set off from home together to make those dreams real. He thought to himself, not for the first time, that she had truly grown into someone beautiful. He had been quietly making a plan for some time now. Once they had become proper adventurers and saved up enough money, he would buy a ring and finally tell her how he felt. The announcer called for the next person. Both of them turned their heads at once. Leanne said nervously that it was their turn and asked Ark what they should do. Ark suddenly told her to go ahead of him. Leanne looked at him in surprised confusion. He said with a slightly smug and joking manner that what if he turned out to have some incredible power? Would she not feel a little overshadowed if she went after him? He said he was generously giving her a moment of glory first. Leanne looked at him as though she genuinely could not follow his logic, then stepped forward and said she would go first then. After a short wait, a voice from the appraisal area rang out in unmistakable shock. The woman conducting the appraisal called out Leanne's name and announced that her abilities were at hero level. She stated that the level cap had come in at 80 and listed her skills as Sacred Magic, High Priestess, and Goddess's Blessing. Leanne stood completely still, struggling to process what she was hearing. From the crowd around them came wave after wave of astonished reactions. Someone cried out that a cap of 80 was an astonishing height. The woman noted that having 3 priestess skills of that quality was almost unheard of. The normal figure was around 30. More voices rose all around in excitement and disbelief. The guild staff broke into warm cheers and told Leanne they were all rooting for her future. Leanne thanked them in a flustered and breathless voice, bowed deeply, and hurried back to Ark with her face bright red from all the attention. Ark stood there looking stunned. He pulled himself together and told her with pride that she was really something special. Leanne laughed and agreed that it had taken her completely by surprise. Ark said brightly that she was absolutely made to be a priestess. Leanne smiled and started to agree, then paused and drifted into her own thoughts for a moment before looking at him and saying that perhaps the path was more like a holy knight than a plain swordsman. Was she right about him? Ark told her confidently to leave it to him. The announcer called the next name, and Ark turned with a burst of energy. Leanne cheered him on with a warm smile. He told her lightly that there was nothing to it, walked up to the counter, and introduced himself. His name was Ark, and he was there to register as an adventurer. The woman agreed right away and asked Ark to place his hand on the crystal ball and wait for the result. Ark wondered to himself whether she had finally understood the situation. Around them, voices from the crowd began to stir. Some people recognized Leanne from before, while others took notice of how young Ark looked. A few people speculated that he might be hiding some incredible ability, and the air around the room filled with a growing sense of excitement and curiosity. Ark kept his thoughts to himself and prayed quietly. He knew that this single moment would determine everything. His only hope was that whatever ability he had would at least be enough to keep Leanne safe. The woman stood still and waited as the crystal ball began to show its result. Then, without any warning, her face turned bright red. She pressed her lips together and shook slightly as she tried her hardest not to laugh out loud. Ark watched her with a puzzled look on his face, unable to understand what was happening. After struggling for a moment, the woman managed to compose herself just enough to make her announcement. She apologized briefly and then revealed what the crystal ball had shown. Ark's level cap was 1. The entire room went dead silent. Nobody said a word. Then, after a short and heavy pause, the silence broke all at once as the crowd burst into loud and uncontrollable laughter. People could not wrap their heads around it. Some had never even heard of such a thing existing. Others pointed out that not only was his level cap sitting at the absolute bottom, but he also carried with him a spell with the grim-sounding name of instant death. The noise and mockery grew louder and louder. Someone from a crowd declared him the weakest magician to have ever existed among all of humanity. Leanne looked around at the laughing faces with visible worry on her own. Leanne called out Ark's name firmly, snapping him back from wherever his mind had gone. She suggested that they step away from the middle of it all and move to a quieter spot. Ark agreed without much thought and followed her. As they stood together in a corner away from the crowd, Ark's mind churned with disbelief. He could not make sense of what the level cap result meant or why it had to be him, of all people. It was the ability he had been born with, and now it felt like a cruel joke. Leanne stood close beside him and watched him quietly without saying anything. Then their stillness was suddenly cut short when a man walked up to them and addressed Leanne directly. He carried himself with confidence, and behind him stood several other people who appeared to be part of his group. Leanne felt a wave of nerves as she tried to figure out who this person was. The man introduced himself as Alan, the leader of an S-rank party. The moment those words left his mouth, Ark's eyes went wide. An S-rank party was not something you came across every day, and hearing that name hit him like a sudden jolt. Alan wasted no time and got straight to the point. He told Leanne that he wanted her to join his party in the role of a priestess. Leanne was completely caught off surprise and could barely form a response. Around them, the crowd reacted with equal shock. People began whispering and talking over one another as they recognized the name. Alan's party was known to have members who had all reached their maximum level, and on top of that, word had spread that they had been directly trusted with a mission from the king himself. The room buzzed with disbelief that someone who had only just registered as an adventurer was already being invited into a group of that rank. Leanne found her voice and questioned why he would want her, pointing out that she was nothing more than a complete beginner still sitting at level 1. Alan turned to his party members and told them to head outside and wait, then gave Leanne his full attention. He told her that her questions were completely understandable and that she had nothing at all to be nervous about. He assured her that being part of his party would push her level up at a speed she could not imagine on her own. He and his members had seen something in her that they simply could not ignore, and they were genuinely amazed by the talent she carried. He then asked her to consider lending her abilities to help the people who needed it. Inside his own head, Ark was firmly and completely against the idea. As far as he was concerned, the answer was an obvious and immediate refusal. All Leanne had to do was say one simple word, and it would all be over. But when he looked over at her, the expression on her face made his eyes go wide. She was not brushing it off. She was deep in thought, turning the offer over in her mind seriously. Ark could not understand why she was even considering it. His mind slipped briefly into an old memory. He remembered a time when Leanne had called out to him warmly, asking whether he was truly serious about becoming an adventurer. He had smiled broadly and told her that he was, that he dreamed of one day having his book published, and that he was certain it would happen. Leanne had listened and started to say something in return, but that memory broke apart before it could finish. It was Leanne's own voice that pulled him sharply back to the present. What he heard stopped him completely. Leanne was not refusing Alan. She was doing the opposite. She was pleading with him, begging him to take her into his party. Ark could not move. He stood frozen in place as the shock washed over him. Alan responded with great enthusiasm, telling her it was a wonderful decision. Without hesitating even for a second, he took Leanne by the arm and began leading her away, already talking about getting her equipped and teaching her everything she would need to know. Ark remained where he stood, and his hands would not stop trembling. Ark called out Leanne's name and told her to wait. He reached out his hand in an attempt to stop her from going, but Alan moved quickly and blocked him before he could reach her. Alan looked at Ark and asked who he was. Ark stared back at him, stunned and unable to respond. Leanne murmured Ark's name quietly from where she stood. Ark looked over at her, his eyes full of hope, saying her name back to her as though it were a question and a plea at the same time. Alan's expression shifted into a smirk. He told Ark that he understood the situation now and apologized for initially mistaking him for someone dangerous. He placed a hand on Ark's shoulder and acknowledged that Ark and Leanne must have had something between them. He told him it was a real shame, but that in the world of adventurers, things like this were simply bound to happen from time to time. It was, as far as Alan was concerned, just the way things worked. Ark tried to protest. He wanted to bring up Leanne to remind her of what they had talked about, the promise they had made to travel together. Alan acknowledged what Ark was trying to say, but he did not waver. Instead, he turned the conversation around and posed a question to Ark, asking him whether he had ever truly stopped to think about what his newly revealed ability actually meant. Alan explained that everything about a person was set from the moment they were born, and that the abilities they carried were nothing less than the power granted to them by the gods themselves. Ark stood there with a storm of conflicting feelings showing plainly on his face. Alan continued, telling Ark that among all the people in the world, Only a rare and select few were born with abilities that went far beyond what ordinary people were capable of. These individuals broke through the boundaries that held normal people back. They were, in Alan's words, the chosen ones. And when placed in surroundings that brought out the full strength of those extraordinary gifts, something truly remarkable was possible. Alan left Ark with one final question, asking him plainly whether he truly believed he could offer Leanne that kind of environment. Ark stood motionless at the door long after Alan had finished speaking. Alan's words continued to ring inside his head, turning over and over. Nearby, two men spoke to each other in low voices, one of them noting how long Ark had been standing there, and the other remarking that it was a genuine pity, though he could not help but think about that skill of his with a grimace. Ark clenched his teeth. He told himself it was not over yet. Then he pushed the door open and walked out into the open with a burst of energy driven more by frustration than confidence. He told himself that skills were not everything, that there was more to it than that. Before he could finish the thought, something slammed into him with force and sent him crashing straight down to the ground. He stayed still for a moment, quietly absorbing the pain. When he opened his eyes and looked up, a large and powerfully built man was standing over him, looking down at him with cold and cutting eyes. The man told Ark to get out of his way and called him trash without any hesitation or feeling. Fear crept into Ark's expression instantly. Not far away, a young woman had witnessed the whole thing and reacted with a light and almost amused tone, remarking on how harsh it was to call someone trash just because of a small bump. She then turned her attention to Ark and noted that he was still frozen on the ground, asking him in a casual way whether he genuinely thought he was about to be killed, saying she had not heard anything of the sort. Ark trembled where he sat. Then another man nearby spoke up and pointed something out to the person beside him, drawing attention to the large man who had knocked Ark down. People around them began to recognize him, murmuring that he was Balzac, a berserker of the S-class, a wild and powerful fighter known for being completely out of the ordinary. Someone nervously noted how loudly the man was speaking and wondered why he had come all the way to Voltana. Another person nearby shifted the conversation slightly and brought up Alan, saying there was something off about him. The woman they addressed, Emmy, simply responded that none of them had any idea what was really going on. Balzac, irritated by all the noise and attention, grumbled loudly that he wanted to finish his business and leave as quickly as possible. The woman with the cheerful attitude quietly thought to herself about whose fault all of this really was. Ark pulled himself up off the ground quickly. The woman noticed and called out in surprise that he had slipped away. The man beside her wondered aloud what that whole situation had even been about. The crowd around them laughed. Ark pushed his way into the crowd and tried to disappear into it, but then he heard a sharp sound and turned toward it. Every pair of eyes in the area seemed to find him at once. The stares were cold and mocking, and whispers began to pass through the crowd. Words like the weakest, trash, and incompetent reaching his ears one after another. Ark cried out and asked him to stop. One of the men nearby asked him coolly whether he truly thought he could handle all of this. The weight of the stairs became too much, and Ark turned and ran. He ran until he reached the forest at the edge of town, where he finally stopped, breathing hard and heavily. His eyes were unsettled and full of nerves. His mind was hazy when he tried to think back on what had just happened. After being pinned under the cold glare of that large man, something inside him had snapped, and he had taken off running without thinking clearly. Now he found himself deep in the trees, completely alone and still without Leanne. He told himself it was already too late to change anything. But more than any of that, the thought that sat heaviest on him was that in a town packed with adventurers who looked at him as though he had no worth at all, there was simply no place for him. He did not belong there. Then, from somewhere nearby, a sound broke through the quiet of the forest. Ark flinched sharply when something suddenly leapt out from the grass near him. He steadied himself and looked down at what had startled him. It was a slime, and he let out a slow breath, caught somewhere between relief and irritation at the slimy little thing that had given him such a sudden shock. The sight of it gave him an idea. He decided that since he was already out here with nothing else going on, he might as well try using his abilities for the very first time and see what they actually did. What he quickly discovered, however, was that his instant death magic did not even work on the weakest monster in existence. That result alone explained why the skill had earned such a terrible reputation. On top of that, he still had no real understanding of how the magic was supposed to function in the first place. He tried to recall the words he needed and quietly muttered the incantation for death. The moment he did, a black shape appeared in the air. It was formed like a skull, and the sight of it made his stomach tighten with nerves. He had not expected it to look quite so unsettling. He stared at it, wondering what it was about to do. Even with his level sitting at 1, he thought that if the spell actually worked, then at least there was something to hold on to. The black skull drifted toward the slime. Then, slowly, it faded and disappeared without doing anything at all. Ark could not believe it. He tried again immediately, sending another black skull flying at the slime. It vanished again, just the same as before, leaving absolutely no effect. Before he could react further, a wave of sudden and heavy exhaustion crashed through his entire body. He wondered whether this was what it felt like to use magical power for the very first time, and whether this drained and painful feeling was all he had to show for spending so much of it. He had used up real energy and could not even bring down a slime. The thought settled on him heavily. A bitter and hollow laugh slipped out of him as a memory came drifting back. He dropped his knees right there on the ground. Leanne's voice rose up in his mind, warm and clear, reminding him of the promise she had once made to him, that someday he would include her in his party. The memory cut deep. Images of Leanne began coming to him one after another, each one from a different point in their lives. He saw her as a young girl, her eyes wide and full of light, calling his name. Then a little older, still smiling, still calling out to him the same way. Then again, slightly changed, but always with that same smile and the same warmth. And then, last of all, the image of her walking away with Alan beside her. Something broke open inside him, and he cried out. Tears ran freely down his face. There in the stillness of the forest, with no one around to hear him, the sound of his crying spread out through the dark, and the wind moved softly through the trees around him. Eventually the storm inside him settled. He sat quietly for a while and let the silence be. He told himself there was no use staying where he was forever. There was nothing ahead of him, and going back to his hometown felt like the only direction left. Then the slime from before appeared again, hopping up in front of him as though it had never left. Ark looked at it for a moment. He thought about how funny it was, in a sad kind of way, that the weakest monster and the weakest adventurer had both ended up in the same quiet corner of the forest. In a strange and small way, they felt like companions in that. He said sorry to the slime for trying to attack it earlier, then stood up and told himself it was time to head back. He had barely taken a step when something made him stop completely. A massive shadow stretched across the ground in front of him. He looked up slowly and his whole body went stiff. Standing over him was an enormous beast, a bear of terrifying size. The slime beside him recoiled immediately. The bear flicked out its tongue and then raised its huge paw to strike. Ark stared up at it, every muscle in his body tight with fear. The slime wasted no time and leapt away to safety. The bear let out a deep and rumbling growl before launching itself forward. Ark threw himself out of the way, just barely in time to avoid the first strike. He caught his breath and quickly assessed what he was dealing with. This was no ordinary animal. This was a killing bear, a monster that adventurers of C rank were advised to handle with care. There is absolutely no reason for a complete beginner like him to be anywhere near something like this, and he could not understand why such a dangerous creature would appear so close to town. One thing was clear to him, though. He was in serious trouble. He turned and ran. The bear caught up to him before he could get far. One heavy strike sent him flying through the air and slamming into the trunk of a tree with a brutal and sickening impact. He crumpled, and blood came from his mouth when he coughed. His thoughts were dark and bitter as he lay there. He thought about how fitting it all seemed to be someone written off and thrown away, stuck at level 1, beaten down by a creature in the middle of nowhere. He thought about being left behind by the person he had grown up with, being laughed at by people who saw no value in him, and now dying alone in a forest without having done a single thing worth doing. It seemed like exactly the kind of ending that would belong to someone like him. But something pushed back against those thoughts. He clenched his teeth and rejected the idea completely. He was not going to die there. He had not even begun yet. The only thing that was going to finish him in that place was the beast itself, and even that was not certain. The bear loomed over him, growling loudly. Ark thrust out his hand and cast a spell. Shadows poured out from his palm, and the black skull screamed through the air toward the beast. They struck it hard, and the bear let out a shriek of agony as the magic tore into it. The sound rang out through the forest and then faded. Silence followed. Ark opened his eyes. The bear was on the ground, completely still. Its mouth hung open and its eyes had gone blank and empty. Ark checked it carefully and could barely believe what he was looking at. The bear was dead. His instant death magic had actually worked. He let out a long and exhausted breath, and then let the reality of it settle over him. A grin broke through despite everything, and he allowed himself a genuine moment of victory, pumping himself up quietly as he sat there on ground. He had done it. He had survived. But before he could fully catch his breath or enjoy the moment, a strange glow began to appear somewhere nearby. Light gathered and pulsed, and something began to take shape at its center. Ark sat surrounded by the brightness, completely puzzled by what he was seeing. A window appearing in the air in front of Ark. He reacted with wide-eyed shock as he read what it said. His skill level had gone up, and the window was asking him to put his points somewhere. He stared at the floating screen for a moment, completely taken by it. He found it genuinely fascinating and tried moving around to see if it would follow him, which it did. He vaguely recalled hearing something about skill levels before and began to wonder whether this had something to do with his own abilities. He reached out and tapped the floating window. A soft chime rang out the moment he touched it, and without any warning, the skull image on the screen snapped its jaws open wide. The display then shifted and showed him his basic information. His name was listed as Ark, and his occupation was shown as Daredevil Magician. A row of stats appeared below, and he looked them over carefully. He confirmed that yes, these were his own stats being displayed. His overall level was still sitting at 1, just as it had been. But then something else caught his eye. His instant death magic was listed at level 20. He took a moment to slowly piece together what that meant. It began to dawn on him that this might be a type of ability where the skill itself was the thing that grew and developed, rather than the person's overall level. He had never come across or heard of anything like that before, and part of him still had trouble believing it was real. But if it truly worked that way, then there was something worth paying attention here. He grabbed the floating window and looked for more information. The screen brought up a skill map. He was surprised to see that skills could be laid out in a map format like this. He tapped into the skill details and read through what came up. The description explained that the effective range of the ability was very short, which meant that attempting it from a distance had a low chance of working. It was far better used at close range. It also noted that by spending points, he could unlock additional special effects and abilities tied to the skill. As he read through this, something clicked into place for him. He thought about how mages in a party always position themselves at the back, far away from whatever they were fighting. That distance would naturally make a short-range instant death skill nearly impossible to land successfully, which explained why there were so few recorded cases of it actually working and why almost no one had been able to confirm its effectiveness. Then he thought back to what had just happened with the killing bear. He had been right next to it when he cast the spell. That closeness must have been the reason it actually connected and worked. The distance had not been a problem because there was almost none. He also noticed something else as he checked himself over. His body felt fine. The injuries he had taken from the bear were completely gone, which seemed to indicate that leveling up the skill carried the same kind of restorative effect as a normal level increase would. Everything was healing as though the fight had not happened. He turned his attention back to the points he now had available. He had 20 skill points and a map in front of him to spend them on. He thought it was best to just place them somewhere that looked like it had potential. As he looked over the map, new symbols began appearing on the screen one by one. One of them caught his attention right away. It looked like a coffin. He tapped it to see what it did. The description that came up explained that through his instant death magic, he had the ability to defeat an enemy and then store their body in a separate dimension. He was stunned. He had not expected anything like that. He thought about how difficult it normally was to handle monsters after defeating them, all the work of breaking them down and carrying them back on your own. Having the ability to simply store them away would make that entire process far easier. He decided it was worth having and moved to test it out right away. He held out his hand and cast the spell quietly in his mind, focusing on the coffin ability. The body of the killing bear began to fade slowly, and then it disappeared entirely. He watched it vanish with a sense of genuine amazement. Something that massive had just been swallowed up completely. He turned back to the screen to see what else was there. He did not have many points left, but there was one more symbol he had not looked at yet. He tapped it and read the description. This ability allowed him to take some of the defeated enemy's stats and convert them into power of his own. He stared at the screen, barely able to believe what he was reading. The cost was steep at 5 points, but what it offered in return was extraordinary. He did not yet know exactly how effective it would be in practice, but for someone in his position, someone who had no way of raising his own stats through normal means, this felt like the most important thing he could possibly get his hands on. And unlike so many things that had seemed too good to be true in his life, the coffin ability had already proven that the descriptions on this screen were accurate and honest. He did not hesitate for even a second and went ahead and acquired it. With that, all of his skill points were spent. He leaned back and looked over what he had done with them. He felt reasonably good about the choices he had made. On top of everything else, he realized how convenient it was to be able to look at his own stats directly through this system, without needing to go through the ability appraisal process at all. The floating window disappeared as quietly as it had come. Ark stood in the stillness that followed and took stock of everything that had happened that day. Somehow, despite how much had gone wrong, his heart felt surprisingly calm, almost as though none of it had been real. Through what felt like pure luck, he had managed to reach into something new inside himself at the very edge of death and pull himself back from it. And in doing so, he had caught a glimpse of something that felt like real hope. He closed his eyes for a moment and let that feeling settle into him. Everything else that had been weighing on him, all the humiliation, all the loss, all the confusion, faded into the background. There was only this one thing now, this single goal that had taken over his entire mind. He had no way of knowing yet how far he could go or what his limits were, but he was ready to find out. He made a decision right there in that forest. He would think of himself as someone starting completely fresh, someone new, and he would take hold of what was in front of him. The one who had been called the weakest of all, he told himself, was going to become the strongest. That night, Ark made his way to the Boltana branch of the Adventurers Guild. When Emmy saw what he had brought with him, her jaw dropped completely. Ark told her he wanted to sell the creature as material. Emmy stood frozen, staring at the massive body of the killing bear in total disbelief. She could not process what she was seeing. She wanted to know how he had come to possess a monster of C rank or higher, especially since he had come in empty-handed earlier in the day. Ark told her simply and calmly that he had taken it down using his instant death magic. Emmy tried to form words and could not quite manage it. Ark told her not to worry about it and to stay calm. Around them, voices from other people in the guild began to stir. Some recognized him as the person who had been labeled the weakest earlier that same day and could not understand why he was now standing in front of Killing Bear. Others noted that he had arrived with nothing on him before and were confused about where the massive creature had suddenly come from. One person said it was their first time ever seeing a killing bear up close in real life. Ark, unbothered by any of it, simply asked Emmy again to go ahead and purchase it from him. Emmy, still shaken but pulling herself together, said she would handle it. At that moment, the door to the guild swung open. Both Emmy and Ark looked toward the entrance. 3 men walked in, professionals affiliated with the guild who specialized in breaking down monster materials. The moment they noticed the dead killing bear, one of them lit up immediately. The man in the middle spoke up with obvious excitement, saying he had heard there were some high-quality materials to be had here and that he simply had to come see for himself. Another of the 3 rushed straight over to the bear and examined it closely with growing amazement. He pointed out that the bear's hide and ore, which would normally be badly damaged after a fight, appeared to be completely intact. The man in the middle added that a killing bear was the kind of creature that operated deep in dangerous forest territory, and that it was almost unheard of for a fight with one to end with the materials left in such clean condition. He was genuinely surprised. The man then turned his attention to Ark and asked directly whether they could purchase the bear from him. Ark told him to please go ahead. The man immediately called out to his crew, and all 3 of them got to work without another moment's delay. Emmy came back after a short wait and set a bag down in front of Ark with an apology for making him wait. She announced that inside were 20 gold coins as his reward for selling the bear, and that the amount already included a bonus based on the guild's own quality assessment, which had taken the excellent condition of the materials into account. Someone nearby offered a friendly greeting as Ark prepared to leave. He stood at the exit for a moment, then stepped outside. As he walked away from the guild, Ark turned the situation over in his mind with quiet satisfaction. He had ended up with far more money than he had expected to get. He also thought that having the coffin ability, the one that let him store defeated monsters away in a separate dimension, was already proving itself to be extremely useful. He made his way to the inn for the night, feeling a sense of steadiness he had not had in a long time. He had enough funds now to support whatever came next, and he told himself he would get moving early the following morning. When morning came and the town began to wake up, Ark was already out and about. A man at one of the shops noticed him and seemed mildly surprised to see someone so young up and moving around with such purpose at that early hour. He wondered to himself what had brought the boy in. Ark told him plainly that he was planning to head into a dungeon and wanted to get properly equipped before setting off. To back up his request, he held up a gold coin. The man's entire attitude shifted the instant he saw it. His eyes went wide, and he rushed over to Ark with a wide and enthusiastic smile, treating him now with the full warmth and energy of someone greeting a very valued customer. The man launched into an energetic and thorough rundown of everything Ark would need. He started with a lantern, calling it an absolute must. He then moved on to pouches for keeping water and food organized and within easy reach. He strongly suggested that Ark upgrade his armor as well, pointing out that what he was currently wearing was not going to hold up for dungeon exploration. Ark, a little overwhelmed by the man's rapid and cheerful enthusiasm, gave in and told him to go ahead with all of it. After a short while, the man stepped back and admired the result with clear delight, declaring that everything looked wonderful on Ark. He walked him through the rest of the items he had put together, which included potions, portable food, and a hanging lantern. For water, he had picked out a leather flask, which he described with genuine pride as both practical and classy. He had carefully selected enough supplies to last roughly 1 to 2 days. He also presented Ark with a waist pouch, talking up how well it combined convenience with style and how much easier it made things to have both hands free. Ark told him he would take everything and also asked if a map could be attached somewhere on his gear. He thanked the man warmly before heading off. With his equipment sorted and his map in hand, Ark set out toward his destination. According to the map, the nearest dungeon from Boltana was located in the eastern forest. When he had asked one of the town sentries about it earlier, they had told him it was roughly an hour's walk on foot. He accepted that and moved with quiet determination. His top priority was clear in his mind. He needed to get stronger, and the way to do that was to keep using his instant death magic and stacking up the stat absorption that came with it. The most efficient place to do that, where monsters appeared constantly and in numbers, was inside a dungeon. He knew that going in alone was not the normal way of doing things, and that most adventurers would not attempt it without a party. But for him, given his situation, going alone was the only real option. He told himself to just get started and figure the rest out as he went. He walked into the forest and followed the main path, which was wide and well-traveled enough to make the journey fairly easy. After a while, he noticed a posted guide marker and followed it deeper into the trees. He paused at some point to take a drink from his leather flask, wiping his mouth as he looked up and found himself standing in front of a large cave entrance. He had arrived. Ark stood at the mouth of the dungeon and took a moment to collect his thoughts. He understood, from what he had read and heard, that dungeons were essentially the primary workplace of adventurers. The way they were structured was well documented. A dungeon was divided into sections known as layers, each one going deeper than the last. The dungeon was a deeply mysterious place where every layer held its own distinct structure and landscape, each one different from the last. As adventurers descended further down through the layers, the difficulty of what they faced grew steadily greater. But the rewards waiting at those deeper levels were more than enough to match the danger. And that balance was exactly what kept adventurers coming back and pushing themselves further. For Ark, however, that was not what he was here for. Not yet. The rewards that other adventurers chased deeper in the dungeon were not his concern right now. What the dungeon offered him was something more immediate and more personal. It was full of monsters, and fighting those monsters was the entire point of being here. That was his reward. He stepped slowly inside the cave and moved forward into the dungeon. His eyes carried both nerves and a quiet but firm sense of purpose. He decided that starting at the upper level was the right call. That area alone would be more than enough to properly test how his upgraded instant death magic performed under real conditions. He walked carefully as the dungeon closed in around him and the darkness grew thicker, and his ears caught a sound. He stopped and turned toward it, alert and waiting. From out of the shadows, a pair of feet emerged, and then another, and then more. The shapes moved slowly into the dim light and revealed themselves. They were goblins. Ark felt a small ripple of nerves, but steadied himself. He knew what goblins were. On their own, each one was not particularly powerful, but they were not the type to fight alone. They were clever enough to use weapons and smart enough to coordinate with one another, which meant that in a group, they could easily overwhelm someone who was not backed up by a party of their own. They were ranked at the bottom of the threat scale, labeled as E-rank monsters, but that did not mean they were harmless to someone in his position. If anything, he thought someone like him was exactly the kind of target they would love to gang up on. Even so, he did not run. The goblins filled the silence of the dungeon with the sound of their laughter, their eyes locked onto Ark with sharp and hostile intent. Then one of them moved. It launched itself into the air and came straight at him in an attempt to strike. Ark did not flinch. He stood completely still, his eyes calm and steady, watching the creature come at him with a quiet and unshakable confidence. Inside the dungeon, where the goblins let out loud and excited cheers as one of their own broke from the group and hurled itself toward Ark. Ark was ready. He reminded himself of the one thing that mattered most when it came to instant death magic. Distance was everything. The range he had strengthened the day before gave him a success rate of 2, but only if he kept the enemy close enough. He told himself to draw them in as much as possible and wait for the right moment. The goblin leapt through the air toward him. Ark held his ground and waited until it was within reach. Then he extended his hand and cast a death spell. The black skull shot out and slammed into the goblin. The creature screamed and dropped to the ground without another sound. Ark felt a surge of satisfaction. It had worked exactly as he needed it to. The remaining goblins pulled together and seemed to be discussing what to do next. Then they began to spread out and circle around him. Ark noticed this but did not panic. He thought it through quickly and realized that by surrounding him, the goblins had actually done him a favor. They had closed the distance on all sides, which meant he had targets within range no matter which direction he turned. He raised his hand again and cast the spell at another goblin. A black skull tore through the air, and the goblin went down instantly, collapsing without a sound. The one standing beside it reacted with visible shock. Before Ark could reset, another goblin lunged at him and swung. He moved quickly and slipped out of the way, then grabbed the goblin by the head and cast the spell directly onto it at point-blank range. It dropped immediately. What struck him as he fought through the group was that no matter how many times he used the spell in quick succession, the crushing fatigue he had felt the first time he used his magic was not coming. His body was holding up. He also noticed that dodging the goblin's attack had felt almost effortless, and he began to connect the dots. The stat absorption ability, the one that converted a defeated enemy's power into his own, was already making a difference. By the time it was over, every goblin had been defeated. Ark looked around at the results and noted with some amusement that goblins, being as weak as they were, did not contribute much in the way of stat gains. Still, the effect of the ability was adding up, and he pulled up the floating window to check his current numbers. The improvements to his spell's range and success rate were noticeable and made the magic easier to use in general. But what interested him more was the stat growth itself. With every enemy he had taken down, he had felt his body becoming sharper and more responsive. His movements were quicker and lighter than before. If the soul retrieval ability was doing what he thought it was doing, then the benefits it offered were going to be enormous. Taken to its logical conclusion, if he kept this up, he might eventually reach a point where he could use magic without ever running dry. He was about to move on when he noticed that the goblins had left equipment lying on the ground. He paused and wondered whether the storage ability would work on items as well as bodies. He filed that thought away and continued deeper into the dungeon. He came to a stop when the path ahead grew darker than the rest. There was a side tunnel branching off into the shadows. He stepped toward it cautiously and entered. Inside, the walls were close together and the light from his lantern barely reached either side. It was a small and narrow space. Something about it felt off to him almost immediately. Then a shape moved in the darkness ahead. Ark tensed. More shapes followed, pushing forward with an eager and aggressive energy. As they came into view, he recognized what they were. Orcs. They were large creatures with a savage and brutish nature, built far more powerfully than a human, and they carried heavy weapons, thick clubs and axes that they swung with force. The rank of the monsters appearing in the dungeon was clearly beginning to climb. The orcs did not wait. They growled and came at him together, charging forward with their weapons raised. Ark felt a flicker of nerves as he registered just how fast they moved for creatures of their size. One of them brought its weapon down, and a heavy and forceful Ark threw himself out of the way and immediately cast his spell at the same target. The black skull wrapped itself around the orc, and the creature screamed and buckled, dropping to its knees before going still. Unlike the goblins, these enemies required no second thought. The moment an opening appeared, he took it without hesitation. Another orc came charging in right behind the first. It raised its weapon and prepared to strike. But Ark found that he could read the movement. He could see where the attack was going before it arrived. He used that to his advantage, stepping cleanly out of the way and turning to face the next one coming at him. He ran straight toward it, closed the gap, activated the spell, and cast it directly onto the orc as they met. The creature crumpled and hit the ground without a sound. The last orc standing looked on, and for the first time, there was something other than aggression in its expression. It was beginning to sweat. Ark paused and reflected on what had just happened. Even that last attack, the one he had slipped past so cleanly, was something he would not have been able to avoid just a short while ago. The very first stat absorption from the earlier fight had already pushed his speed up noticeably. He had originally planned to focus on improving the effective range of his spell, since that was his biggest weakness. But the way things were developing, he was finding that he could now create the kind of close combat situation that made instant death magic work perfectly. He stood calmly in the middle of the remaining orcs as they closed in around him from every side and came at him all at once. The orcs swung and struck, but when they looked for him, he was gone. He had moved so quickly that he had completely vanished from their field of vision. He reappeared behind them and let them know in a casual tone that their speed had genuinely impressed him. The orcs flinched hard at the sound of his voice coming from behind them. He stepped forward, noted that there were only 3 left, and looked at each of them in turn. The aggression in their eyes had been replaced entirely by fear. He apologized to the nearest one in a light and almost offhand way, then cast his spell on it and finished the fight. Afterward, Ark sat down and took a bite of his snacks. He went over the numbers in his head as he chewed. Even after taking down 5 orcs on top of everything else, his overall level had still not gone up. It seemed that higher-level monsters like orcs did not give as much raw experience as something like a killing bear did, which is a bit of a surprising finding. His thoughts then drifted to something he had heard at some point, that orc meat was considered quite good to eat. He also figured that the orcs he had stored away using his coffin ability would probably fetch a decent sum when he sold them. He was about to continue on when something ahead made him stop. A staircase had appeared in the rocky dungeon wall, seemingly out of nowhere, and at the bottom of it there was a faint glimmer of light. He made his way down toward it. As he stepped through, the light grew suddenly and intensely bright, and he had to squint against it as his eyes adjusted. What greeted him on the other side left him completely speechless. He walked further in and looked around with open amazement. The ceiling above him was lined with glowing stones that cast light across the entire space below, and the space itself was extraordinary. There was a forest inside the dungeon, with actual trees stretching upward and a river running through it. He could barely believe what he was seeing. He wondered to himself whether this was what it meant to move from one layer to the next. It was almost impossible to accept that this place was still part of the dungeon at all. With this much natural light filling the space, his lantern was completely unnecessary. Then he heard a voice calling out from somewhere nearby. He turned and looked. There were people here. A man was shouting and waving in his direction. Ark waved back, puzzled by the energy behind it. He could not quite make sense of what the fuss was about. Before he could think on it further, 3 adventurers came running toward him at full speed. One of them grabbed him and immediately asked whether he was all right. Ark was confused and asked if something was the matter. Another of the 3 pointed out that when he looked more carefully, he was looking at a child wandering alone in a place like this. The man's concern quickly turned to exasperation, and he said that the one who was truly out of his mind was Ark himself. A third man, broad-faced with a beard, stared at Ark with a heavy look. Ark stared back at him with mild awkwardness. The bearded man pressed him on how he had possibly ended up in here on his own and asked whether he was hurt anywhere. Ark told them plainly that he had fought some monsters on his way down, but that it was nothing serious and there was no need to worry. The man stared at him in disbelief. He could not understand why anyone would willingly go into battle alone in a dungeon, and asked bluntly whether Ark had some kind of death wish. Ark told him no, that was not at all, and that he had no intention of anything like that. The man shook his head and muttered about how reckless it was to go on a solo expedition. While the man still had his hand gripping Ark's shoulder, another hand came in softly and pulled it away. It was the woman in the group. She stepped in calmly and pointed out that since Ark was clearly fine, there was no need to make a bigger deal of it than necessary. She then mentioned that their group was on their way back to the surface anyway, and invited Ark to come along with them if he was interested. The second man laughed and brought up the fact that they had managed to collect a great haul of orc meat during their time in the dungeon. He was eager to get back to town and turn in a coin. The bearded man agreed that it had been fortunate to run into Ark here, in this particular spot, and said that they would escort him back to town with them. Ark asked about the place they were standing in, curious about why it felt so different from the rest of the dungeon. The bearded man responded with a grin, guessing that Ark had not yet heard about it. He explained that the dungeon, for reasons nobody had ever fully figured out, contained certain places like this one. There were pockets within the dungeon that no monsters could enter, strange and unexplained safe zones where adventurers could rest and breathe before continuing deeper or heading back to the surface. He and his group were using it as exactly that, a stopping point before making their way back up. Ark took that in quietly. He had not known that safe zones existed inside dungeons, but now that he did, it opened up a whole new picture of what moving through a dungeon could look like. Ark thought to himself that there seemed to be more to this safe zone than just a resting spot, that there was likely some kind of additional mechanic or function to it that could be put to good use. Before he could think on it further, the man from the group announced that it was time for them to get moving and head back up. Ark quickly told them to go on without him, that he was going to stay where he was for now. But before anyone could respond to that, a loud noise suddenly rang out from somewhere nearby. The man turned sharply toward the direction it came from, confused and on alert. Then, from between the trees of the dungeon forest, a pair of feet stumbled into view. They were badly wounded. More injured men followed, dragging themselves out of the forest with great difficulty, their bodies clearly having taken serious damage. The man reacted with shock and rushed toward them, demanding to know what had happened. One of the wounded men could barely get his words out. He begged desperately to be saved, pleading over and over for help. The man told him firmly to calm down and reminded him that they were standing in a safe zone, that no monsters could reach them here. He then called out to the woman in his group by name, Azurii, and told her to get to work healing them right away. Azurii responded immediately and got to work. She used her healing abilities on the wounded man without hesitation. When she checked on him shortly after, he told her that he was feeling much better and thanked her. Once he had caught his breath enough to speak properly, the man from Ark's group asked him to explain what had happened out there. The wounded man turned the question back on them first and asked whether any of them had ever gone up against a skeleton before. Ark felt a small jolt of surprise at the question. The man from the group turned the word over quietly, thinking about what he knew of skeletons. He acknowledged that undead monsters were certainly a nuisance to deal with, but pointed out that skeletons were ranked at D, which meant that for any reasonably experienced adventurer, handling them should not be beyond reach. There should be no real problem bringing them under control. The wounded man agreed that was exactly what he and his companions had thought going in. They had felt the same way and had not been particularly worried about it. But then something had happened that changed everything. He paused, and the group gathered around him and listened as he began to tell them what they had encountered. Inside the dungeon, with a sudden shout about a giant skeleton, one of the wounded men in the group confirmed that he had encountered it himself. He described it as having the basic shape of a human body, but massively enlarged. He went on to explain that in other parts of the world, creatures of this type were referred to as ogres or giants. While they varied from one individual to the next, They could reach a rank of B and grow to nearly 4 meters tall, making them extraordinarily dangerous to face. Someone in the group let out a frustrated and disbelieving groan. The man wearing a hat could not wrap his head around why a monster of that scale would be appearing on the upper level of the dungeon at all. He pointed out that their group was only D rank, and that even with all of them fighting together as a party, there was simply no way they could win against something like that. The second wounded man tried to calm the group down, telling them not to worry. He explained that the skeleton was still back by the far wall, and that he had managed to escape by moving through a passage between the trees. A creature that size, he reasoned, would have no way of fitting through that kind of narrow opening. He asked the group if they could rest a little longer before taking him with them back to the surface. Before anyone could answer, a sound echoed through the space. Ark turned toward it and asked the others if they had heard it too. One of the men told him not to say things like that, clearly unsettled. And the sound came again, louder this time. The group erupted into alarm. Everyone had heard it now. The man in the hat muttered in confusion, unable to figure out where it was coming from. Then the answer came. A massive skeleton hauled itself up over the edge of the cliff and came into full view. Both Ark and the man nearest to him went rigid with shock. The monster reached for its weapon. One of the men let out a cry of fear. Ark stood and watched the enormous creature with every nerve in his body on edge. The skeleton pulled itself up fully onto the cliff, and the adventurers immediately broke into a run to put distance between themselves and it. Ark noted with grim amazement the way the creature had scaled the cliff and moved. Its mobility was far beyond what its size should have allowed. The wounded man could not believe it either, unable to accept that the skeleton had actually climbed up after them. The massive creature went still for a moment. Then it opened its jaws and let out a roar that shook the air around them. The sound hit each adventurer somewhere deep and instinctive. No reasoning was needed. Every one of them understood in that moment the enormous and unbridgeable gap between themselves and this thing. This was not a fight. This was a death sentence. One of the men stood completely frozen, his mind racing over what he could possibly do. Then something shifted in him, and he made a decision. He called out to his companion Doug and told him to push back the wounded men together with Azuli and get them to the exit. He then turned to Ark and began to tell him to come along with the others. His words never finished. Ark was already moving, and he was running straight toward the monster. The man stared after him in complete disbelief. Ark closed the distance toward the skeleton ogre at full speed, his mind tracking the creature's movements as he ran. He registered that the gap in speed between himself and the monster was not as wide as he had expected. That was something he could work with. His one pressing concern, the thing sitting at the back of his mind as he ran in, he reached his range and cast the spell. The black skulls surged toward the skeleton ogre. The monster looked at the approaching skulls with something like surprise in its hollow eyes, then screamed as the magic struck it. The spell had landed, but the creature was still standing. Was whether or not instant death magic would function on an undead creature at all. Behind him, Doug let out a curse and then shouted in stunned amazement. He had watched Ark dodge every single one of the monster's savage attacks without being touched. The other man, watching, quietly began to understand why Ark had claimed to be navigating the dungeon alone. Even so, he observed with concern that what Ark was doing amounted to a defensive battle. The magic he was using did not appear to be finishing the job. The man called out to Doug, telling him he was taking charge of getting the others out, and Doug shouted back at him to run. Meanwhile, Ark was still in the fight and growing frustrated. He had lost count of how many times he had fired the spell. The creature seemed to be resisting it, or at least not going down the way everything else had. And the problem was that instant death magic was the only skill he had. He had nothing else to fall back on. He made a decision and pushed forward, closing the gap even further until he was right at the very edge of the monster's reach, as close as he could possibly get without being inside the range of its attack. He thrust out his hand and cast the spell one more time. Nothing came out. Ark realized with a sinking feeling that he had completely drained his magical power. At that same moment, the skeleton ogre raised its massive weapon high above its head, preparing to bring it down with full force. Ark braced himself with a quiet curse under his breath. Then the monster's hand suddenly exploded. Pieces of it scattered and fell slowly to the ground. Ark stared with wide eyes, not understanding what had just happened. Then he heard a voice shouting out from nearby. One of the men had called out to the skeleton ogre and was drawing its attention toward himself. The monster turned away from Ark and followed the man as he led it into the forest. Once inside among the tall and tightly packed trees, the creature's massive size worked against it, and it let out a frustrated roar as the dense growth closed in around it and restricted its movement. Ark watched and understood immediately what the man had done. In a single sharp moment, he had used the terrain itself to take away two of the monster's greatest advantages, its reach and its freedom of movement. It was a reminder that experienced adventurers did not rely on skills and equipment alone. They read the environment around them and used it as a weapon. The skeleton ogre roared again and swung at the trees in a blind and furious attempt to locate its target. The man pressed himself against a tree trunk and hid as best he could, his thoughts running quickly through the reality of his situation. He knew that all he could do right now was buy time. He had not wanted this role, but he had taken it anyway. His hope was that by staying and acting as bait, the rest of the group would be able to reach the surface safely. As for what would happen to him after that, the thought hung unfinished in his mind. A quiet voice from directly behind him interrupted those thoughts. It was Ark, asking if he was alright. The man's response was immediate and honest. He was not alright. This was complete and utter despair. Then the reality of who was standing behind him hit him all at once, and he nearly jumped out of his skin. Ark quickly gestured for him to stay quiet. The man steadied himself and asked in a hushed voice why Ark had not simply run when he had the speed to do so. Ark told him plainly that he intended to take the monster down. The man looked at him with genuine uncertainty, pointing out that the magic he had just watched Ark use had not appeared to do much of anything. Ark was slightly embarrassed and could not argue with that observation. He explained that his instant death magic was a complicated skill to make work properly. The man froze as those words sank in. Instant death magic. He grabbed Ark and repeated it back to him in barely contained shock, his voice rising more than it should have. The skeleton ogre paused at the sudden noise. Ark immediately covered the man's mouth, and the two of them pressed themselves into hiding as the monster moved slowly past the tree they were sheltering behind, close enough to make both of them hold their breath. Once it had passed, Ark whispered the truth of the situation to him. He had been using instant death magic to defeat monsters throughout the dungeon up to this point. The problem was that he genuinely did not know whether the spell would function against something that was already dead. The man covered his eyes for a moment, processing that. He acknowledged that undead monsters were, by their very nature, already dead, which made the question of whether instant death could affect them a genuinely difficult one to answer. But then his thoughts shifted to something else entirely. He wanted to know how Ark had been able to make the decision to stand and fight in that situation, with that level of uncertainty hanging over him. Ark answered quietly. Even if the magic turned out not to work, he still would have stayed. He pointed out that if everyone had run together, there would almost certainly have been people who did not make it. In that moment, he had been the only one in the group without a party, the only one with no one depending on him and no one he was bound to. He had simply thought that if the worst happened to him, it would not leave a gap that affected anyone else the way it would if one of the others fell. The man was silent for a moment after hearing that. Then he told Ark that he did not think that was true at all. Ark continued, explaining a little more of where he was coming from. He had grown up being told that the power he was born with was worthless. He had never had the chance to fight alongside companions in a party the way most adventurers did. This single skill was all he had, and it was all he had ever had to work with. If he died here because of it, then it would simply confirm what everyone already believed, that both he and his skill amounted to nothing. The man sat with that for a moment, quietly struck by the weight of it and the steadiness with which Ark had said it. Then he made a decision. He told Ark that if the two of them worked together, they could come up with something. They put their heads together and spoke in low and careful voices, working through a plan between them. The man checked once more that Ark was genuinely all right with this. Ark told him that it would feel worse to be the only one walking away at this point, and that having a better chance of winning made it worth staying. The man smiled at that. He introduced himself as Gaston and asked Ark his name in return. Ark told him. Gaston said the name aloud with clear appreciation for it. The sound carried just far enough. The skeleton ogre stopped moving. Gaston and Ark stood side by side, steady and ready, waiting for the right moment to make their move. 3 years before the present, a man delivered news that stopped Gaston cold. He told Gaston that he was being let go. Gaston could not understand it and asked what was meant by that. The man explained that it had not come from the higher ranks as a personal decision against him, but rather that the minimum level cap required for those eligible for military service had been raised across the board. Gaston's cap was set at 30, which the man acknowledged was neither terrible nor impressive, but given the current demands and circumstances, it simply was not going to be enough. With that, everyone in a similar position was being asked to stand down. The man told them all that their service and effort up to that point had been appreciated. Gaston could not accept it so easily. He pushed back, arguing that even if his level was lower than what was now required, the years of experience he had built up still carried real value that could not simply be ignored or replaced. He called out to the captain directly. The captain responded without much softness, pointing out that in their country, level cap and skill ranking were not the only measures of soldiers' worth. He then added that the younger soldiers Gaston had been mentoring and looking after had higher upper limits than he did, and that their potential alone would be more than enough to cover any gaps that experience might have filled. There was nothing left for Gaston to say to that. The words sat on him, and he had no answer for them. As he prepared to leave, one of the younger men asked him with quiet disbelief whether it was true that he was really going. Gaston offered a brief and heavy apology. He told them that there was no hiding it, that his lack of power was simply a fact, and that whatever came next was in their hands. The men called after him, asking him to wait. But Gaston turned and walked away from his comrades with a bitterness he could not shake, leaving under an open and indifferent sky. Back in the present, that memory surfaced in Gaston's mind as he ran through the forest with the skeleton ogre crashing through the trees behind him. The monster wore something that looked almost like a grin as it gave chase and let out a thunderous roar. Gaston shouted at it, daring it to keep coming. At the same time, his mind was working on the problem of how Ark was supposed to take something like this down. He cast his thoughts back to the conversation they had just had while hiding. Ark had explained that the monster had a long reach that made it almost impossible to get inside his effective range, and that its resistance to the magic felt different from any ordinary monster he had faced. What he needed was to use his instant death spell from a greater distance with a higher chance of landing successfully. Gaston had pressed him on the idea of effective range, making sure he understood correctly that the success of the instant death magic was tied to how close Ark was to the target. Ark confirmed that, as far as he understood it, that was exactly how it worked. Gaston had thought it over for a moment and then laid out his plan. He would be the decoy. He would draw the monster's attack and take the hit, creating a single opening for Ark to use. Ark had asked him plainly whether he truly meant to let that blow land, pointing out that it could kill him. Gaston had told him not to judge by appearances. He had served in the military and knew how to take punishment. Even against a stronger opponent, survival was possible as long as the focus stayed on enduring rather than winning. And beyond the practical reasoning, something more personal had driven his answer. A faint image had flickered through his mind at that moment, a version of himself standing in the rain, defeated and shrinking away. He had not become an adventurer only to run from another fight. He was not going to do that again. Now, he was putting that plan into motion. He moved carefully, drawing the monster toward a specific part of the forest where the trees and the way the ground was laid out would work against the skeleton ogre's natural strengths. In a wider open space, the creature could swing freely with long, sweeping attacks and use the full reach of its heavy weapon. But in this narrow passage between the trees, those options were cut off. The monster's attack choices were reduced down to direct sword strikes. Gaston watched it raise its sword and read the motion carefully. He judged that it was setting up for a vertical downward thrust. He positioned himself with a tree at his back, thinking through the angles. Then the monster shifted and chose differently. Rather than a wide swing, it drove forward in a direct thrust. Gaston recognized at the instant it committed to the movement. He understood that he could not match the creature in raw strength or speed, but he also understood that if the attack was coming straight at him, he had something to work with. The moment the monster committed to its strike, he moved forward into it rather than away. He told himself that if he hesitated for even a fraction of a second, it would be over, stepping inside the trajectory to disrupt its timing and reduce the power behind the blow. Absorbing it at an angle rather than head-on was the difference between surviving and not. He stepped forward. The monster's sword came down directly onto his shield. The impact hit him like a wall. The sound of it tore through the air, and Gaston gasped sharply from the force of it. His shield split cleanly in two from the sheer power of the blow. The skeleton ogre came after Gaston again and raised its weapon for another strike. But while the monster's attention was fixed forward, Ark was already moving. He came running hard from behind the creature, his eyes locked on it with complete focus and determination. Gaston threw himself sideways dramatically, completely losing his footing and going down, creating the opening they had planned for. Ark judged the distance and felt certain he had it. He thrust out his hand and cast a spell. Then something stopped him midair. Before the magic could reach its target, the monster moved with unexpected speed and drove its fist straight into Ark, sending him flying through the air. Gaston cried out in shock. His mind raced to make sense of what had just happened. The monster had a hidden ability, an extra arm of some kind that it had taken from another ogre's body and made its own. Ark hit the ground hard and cried out from the impact. Gaston called out to him, his voice tight with worry. Before he could do anything else, the skeleton ogre turned on him and attacked in one fast and brutal motion, tearing through the armor he was wearing. Ark's eyes flew open. He pushed himself up off the ground, registering that he had blacked out for a moment from the hit. His first thought was of Gaston. He looked around, and when Gaston came into view, fear rushed through him. The monster was walking past Ark now, moving toward Gaston with clear intent. Ark forced himself to his feet despite the pain that shot through him with every movement. He took stock of his situation quickly and honestly. He was not completely unable to move, but the speed and agility he needed to dodge attacks in close distance rapidly were beyond him right now. And the monster's hidden arm had made the fight on the ground far more dangerous and unpredictable than before. He clenched his teeth and pushed his mind hard, demanding that it find something, anything at all that could change what was happening. Then something surfaced from deep in his memory. A pair of cold and cutting eyes staring him down, and a voice calling him worthless. The image sharpened something inside him. Meanwhile, Gaston stood and watched the monster coming toward him. His body was shaking, and he cursed under his breath. He had known somewhere in himself that it might come to this. He told himself that if Ark was still alive, the right thing now was for him to run. There was no shame in it. Running was the sensible choice. His thoughts shifted to his companions, to Doug and Azuri, and he offered them a quiet and wordless apology for how things had turned out. He let his gaze drift slowly upward. His eyes went wide. Ark was in the air above and behind the monster, having leapt up without making a sound. Gaston could not believe what he was seeing. Ark's mind was clear and fast. This was the last chance they had. He was going to use gravity itself, dropping from above in one clean and swift movement to close in on the creature. All he needed was to get his hands on it. He was going to bring death down on it from above. The skeleton ogre sensed something and spun around, letting out a thunderous roar as it looked up. Gaston watched with his mouth open. The monster swung at Ark while he was still in the air. In the fraction of a second available to him, Ark used the stored body of the dead orc from his coffin ability as a shield, putting it between himself and the monster's strike just in time to avoid the killing blow. Gaston stared in pure disbelief. Ark called on the coffin of the dead and released what he had stored, using it in that final moment. Then he came down on the monster and drove his instant death spell into it with everything he had left. On the other side of the dungeon, the rest of the group had frozen in place as sounds continued to echo through from the direction of the fight. Doug was trying to hold himself together, wondering what was happening to Gaston. One of the men in the group began to crumble under the pressure, saying it was hopeless and that they should retreat before the monster reached them too. Doug turned on him with fury, grabbing him by the collar. He was not going to hear that. Gaston was still in there. A voice called for everyone to stay calm. Doug stormed outside anyway, furious and helpless, unable to do anything but wait and curse the situation. Then the trees at the edge of the forest shook violently. Everyone went still. The skeleton ogre burst out from between the trees and let out one final roar. Doug and Azuri both froze, barely managing to react. Then the monster stopped. The light went out of its eyes all at once. Its knees buckled, and it came crashing down to the ground with a deep and heavy thud that shook the air. As the dust and haze began to clear, Doug squinted through it. Two shapes were coming through the settling cloud. They took form slowly, and then there they were. Ark and Gaston walking out together. Doug stood completely still for a moment, too stunned to move. Then the breath he had been holding came rushing out of him. Without a second's hesitation, he and Azuri ran toward them. Doug's relief burst out of him completely, and he jumped with joy, unable to contain what he felt at seeing them come back alive.